So before we talk about more alleged contradictions today, I want to talk about this concept of a web of beliefs. And if you were in my class last quarter, you heard me mention this, but we all had this structure of beliefs, and at the very center are very core beliefs to our being. And just like a spider web, if we destroy that core in the web, well, the web is useless, right? The whole web comes down. The same way with our beliefs in Christianity. We have core tenet beliefs, such as belief in God. If it were to be shown that God does not exist, what would happen to our web of Christianity? Well, there's no point in believing in baptism or worship or giving or any of those other things if, in fact, God does not exist. That's a very tenet belief to our system. What about something like baptism? Would that be at the center? A little further out? That's for each one of us to decide. What about worship in a building? Is that at the center of our web? Oh, probably not. Probably way out there, if it's on the web at all, right? So if that were to go, that's not going to destroy the web. But what about the belief in the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ? What if that were to go? Would that be a core belief? Would that be destructive to our web? It would, wouldn't it? As Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, 16, and 17, if Christ isn't raised from the dead, well, we're in bad trouble, aren't we? That's a paraphrase. I didn't directly quote that. So in comes Bart Ehrman. Now, Bart Ehrman was converted to Christianity at a young age. He remained a Christian for most of his adult life. He is currently the professor or a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina, where he teaches the history, New Testament history primarily, I believe. He is no longer a Christian. Something happened to Dr. Ehrman's web of beliefs that caused him to be an agnostic. He's abandoned the faith. He is still professor of religious studies, but he teaches now in a different light. He now shows students and people how to find the errors and the discrepancies and the contradictions in the Bible. So totally gone to the other side of the teaching spectrum. What happened to Dr. Ehrman? Well, he found a contradiction, and I will say a so-called or an alleged contradiction. As Marty said, it's a lot of words to say alleged every time, but he thought he found a contradiction in the book of Mark, and based on that one contradiction, he abandoned his faith. That seems a little extreme, doesn't it? One contradiction? I'm not saying it was a contradiction, but just one contradiction, and when he tells a story, I mean, you can go YouTube it. He's got a lot of videos out there, a lot of propaganda, but it seems a little extreme to me. Wouldn't you want to investigate that alleged contradiction and be absolutely sure that there was a mistake or there's an error in the Bible before you just cut out that core of your web of beliefs? We're not going to look at the contradiction that caused Dr. Ehrman to abandon his faith, but we are going to we're going to listen to an audio clip here in just a moment where Bart Ehrman is debating Dr. William Lane Craig, who's a Christian philosopher, and this is a 2-hour debate. We're not going to listen to the whole thing, but I got a 2-minute audio clip where Dr. Ehrman just sort of rambles off all these alleged contradictions surrounding the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. I've based this entire lesson on his list, right? This short list. We may not get through all of them today. I'm assuming we can spill over into next week. I don't know. I think we're on a pretty easy time schedule here. We're going to get through as much as we can. So let's listen to this clip. Now, before we go into this clip, I do have to say, I think for every example we find of a Christian who has turned and is now atheistic or agnostic, personally, I think there could be a public reason for this and a private reason for this. Doesn't it sound much more intellectual to say, well, I abandoned Christianity because I found errors in the sacred texts? Or does it sound better to say, I abandoned Christianity because I just want to do whatever I want to do and enjoy the pleasures of the world? I'm not saying Dr. Ehrman had a private reason. I think that sometimes there are public and private reasons. So if we could play the clip now. I think it's loud enough. I came up here yesterday, tested the audio. We should be able to hear this. It's only 2 minutes, so let's hear what Dr. Ehrman has to say about these contradictions.
Read one story in Matthew and the same story in Mark and compare your two stories and see what you come up with. You come up with major differences. Just take the death of Jesus. What day did Jesus die on? And what time of day? Did he die on the day the day before the Passover meal was eaten, as John explicitly says, or did he die after it was eaten, as Mark explicitly says? Did he die at noon, as in John, or at 9 a.m., as in Mark? Did Jesus carry his cross the entire way himself, or did Simon of Cyrene carry his cross? It depends which gospel you read. Did both robbers mock Jesus on the cross, or did only one of them mock him and the other come to his defense? It depends which gospel you read. Did the curtain in the temple rip in half before Jesus died or after he died? It depends which gospel you read. Or take the accounts of the resurrection. Who went to the tomb on the third day? Was it Mary alone, or was it Mary with other women? If it was Mary with other women, how many other women were there? Which ones were they, and what were their names? Was the stone rolled away before they got there, or not? What did they see in the tomb? Did they see a man? Did they see two men? Or did they see an angel? It depends which account you read. What were they told to tell the disciples? Were the disciples supposed to go to Jerusalem and see Jesus there? Were they supposed to stay in Jerusalem and see Jesus there? Or were they to go to Galilee and see Jesus there? Did the women tell anyone or not? It depends which gospel you read. Did the disciples never leave Jerusalem? Or did they immediately leave Jerusalem and go to Galilee? All of these depend on which account you read. You have the same problems for all of the sources in all of our gospels. These are not historically reliable accounts.
Okay, so you've heard it directly from Dr. Ehrman. And this is a small list. He's got a bigger list, basically ranging most of the entire Bible. But this is definitely core to our belief, so I think it's worth our attention in investigating these. Now, he brings up some good points. Now, again, it's a 2-hour debate, and what he says earlier in the debate is that most people read the Gospels vertically. They'll start at Matthew chapter 1, go to the end of the book, Mark chapter 1, end of the book, Luke chapter 1. He said if you want to find the contradictions, if you want to find the discrepancies, you read the Gospels horizontally. You take an event, such as the tomb, right, or the post-mortem appearances, and you look in each of the Gospels, you write those down, and you say they don't match, they don't line up. He says that's the best way to find these alleged errors or contradictions. Now, before we get into this first question, which is kind of a heavy one, and we'll be thinking about this throughout the remainder of the class, let's imagine that we had 4 men in this congregation that wanted to write about the services here, the congregation, the activities, the people, and they kind of wanted to give a history as they seen it, as they write these things down. And I just put down some names here. Let's say one of those guys is Dayton Cassie. Think about his writing style, think about his character, and the other, Dave Roberts. Think about his character, perhaps what his writing style would be. Kerry Carpenter, and we'll pick anyone in here. Pick a Johnny Henderson, for example. And we have these 4 guys, and they're going to write about this congregation, the people and events, services and activities. All of them may write about some of the same things, like the building project, for example. Remember the building project we did where we added on, we expanded? Huge undertaking. Now, they may all write about it, but do you think Dave Roberts might have more to say about that, since that was his supervision? I mean, that was his baby, right? He handled that from beginning to end and did a fantastic job. They may all write about the leadership of the congregation, but maybe Dayton would be more detailed in his description of the eldership and the bond that these men have. I mean, and Johnny would probably do the same thing, but from a different perspective. So we can have 4 different accounts of the same type of writing, but they could be vastly different and still agree. Now, I heard Marty say this last week. I know we were busy setting up extra chairs, and I missed a lot of your beginning, but Marty said supplemental information does not equal contradiction. Would we agree with that? Take any 2 people in here that eyewitnessed the same event, we're going to have different ways of describing that event. Some are going to see more details than others. If it's me, I'm not going to see the details because I miss things, honestly. Someone else can describe it in greater detail. So this is how I want us to approach these 4 Gospels. Not that they're contradictory. They're innocent until proven guilty. We covered that as well. The way we want to approach it is, are they supplemental to one another? Does one Gospel writer give details in an event that the other doesn't? That doesn't make them contradictory. That means there's additional information here. They may have the same types of information about the same event, some may have greater detail. This does not constitute a contradiction. And I think this is one way, not that I'm smarter than Dr. Ehrman, but I think this is one way that he errs when he's looking at Scripture this way. And by the way, when he rattles off this list of contradictions, there's an alternative, which I think a lot of people who are skeptics seem to want the Bible to be, and that is they want the gospel narratives to parrot each other. Well, how come this gospel writer didn't even mention this or mention it differently? Or how come there are two angels here and one angel here? Now imagine if the four gospels were parroted. Different authors, different writing styles, but they said nearly the exactly same thing. Would that be a red flag? These guys must have corroborated. They must have got together, got their story right. So we can't win as Christians. We can't satisfy the skeptics who are complaining that they're different, and nor would it be a good deal if they were the same, right? I think it's a good thing that we have these variations. And it causes us to study, for one. It caused me to dig deep on a few of these myself when viewing this material. Okay, so let's look at this first question. Now, Matthew, if we have chapter 28, verse 5, Luke 24, verse 4, and John 20, verse 12. I know I skipped Mark. There will be some of these where we don't read all accounts based on time because they say the same thing. So Matthew 28:5, Luke 24:4, and John 20:12. Now the question we're trying to answer is, how many angels at the tomb? Seems like a very simple question. We should be able to go to the Gospels and find that number. What does Matthew say?
But the angel answered and said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus, who was crucified."
How many angels? Seems like one. What does Luke say?
While they were perplexed about this, behold, two men suddenly stood near them in dazzling clothing.
Well, those angels are men. I'm confused.
Snappy dressers, whoever they were.
Okay, snappy dressers, Marty says. Seems to be two in Luke's account. What about John?
20 verse 12 says, "And she beheld two angels in white sitting, one at the head and one at his feet, where the body of Jesus was laid."
How many angels in John? Now, what about their positions? John just said they were seated. What did Luke say? Were they seated or standing? They were standing, right? What about Matthew and the apparently one angel? What was that angel doing?
Speaking directly to
His position was seated on the stone, right? If I remember correctly. So one account says one seated, two standing. The other says two seated. What is it? We have discrepancies. We can't trust them all. Throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're done. Your religion is futile. No, come on. How do we harmonize these accounts? Now, we're not going to fully answer this question, but as we go along, what I want you to do is keep in the back of your mind that there's some basic things we can think about. Whenever we have two, do we also have one? If I've got two children, can I refer to one singularly? Does that mean I don't have the other child anymore? Of course not. Whenever you have two, you have one. Whenever you have three, you have one. Whenever you have three, you also have two. Right? Marty?
How many months have 28 days in them?
Oh. That's a trick question. For the video, how many months have 28 days? Well, the answer is all of them, right? Exactly. So Matthew described an angel, but does he say there was only one angel? Now, if he said there was only one angel, we may have to relook at this, right? But he didn't say there was one and only one, nor do the other gospel writers say there were two and only two. Let's think about that as well as we read some of these other accounts. Anybody have any other comments or questions? Like I said, I don't think we can fully answer this just based on what we've read. But let's also consider, could there have been multiple visits to the tomb? And these gospel writers were writing about separate visits. Is that a possibility? Well, how would that be possible? John 19:41 says the tomb was near the city. In fact, it was in the same garden where Jesus was crucified. Now, by Jewish law, you couldn't execute someone within the city walls, so Jesus was executed outside the city. It wasn't very far. In fact, it was close enough where it would have been easy for multiple trips to have been made. Now, this is an assumption at this point. We don't have enough information to affirm that. But is that a possibility? That Matthew writes about an angel is a separate event than Luke writes about two angels. And these separate events would involve different positions by the angels. Is that a possibility? Now, I think Marty said in either the first or second class that if there's a possibility, if there's a way to harmonize, then that's what we need to do. We need to go with that rather than assume that the gospel writers are guilty. Yes, Mike?
Well, reading in Matthew, this translation says, there was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. Now, what I'm reading from that is that he's accounting for one angel. He said an angel came down and rolled back the tomb. That doesn't say there could have been 30 angels, but an angel came down and rolled back the stone. So I don't see any cause for conflict or whatever there. He's describing the actions of an angel. There's came down and rolled back a stone. Now, if there were 30 of them, 29 of them didn't roll the stone back. One did, and he came down from heaven to do it.
Yeah, and we do the same thing in our own language. If there are two people that we're talking to, but one of them is primarily the speaker and giving us the information, we go back and tell someone else and say, yeah, I spoke with John. Well, was Luke also there? Yeah, he was there, but he didn't do the talking. John did the talking. Whenever you have two, you have one. We could have had 30. It doesn't exclude the possibility of more angels. We're focusing on one. And we combine that with this idea that I want to keep in the back of our minds that there could be multiple visits to the tomb. Unless the back of your mind is like mine, distant and dusty, then don't do that. Listen, and we'll uncover it together. But so the other question, now we haven't fully answered this. How many angels were? There were 1, 2, some were standing, some were seating. Let's keep all this, like I said, in the back of our mind. The next question is, what day and time of day did Jesus die? Did Dr. Ehrman ask. Before we go into this question, I want to give you an illustration. I can't remember the professor's name, but he tells this story of the day his mother died. And he said he receives a call from his brother. His brother was with his mother, and his brother said, Mom's been hit by a bus. She was crossing the street in Chicago. She was hit by a bus. She's gone. And so this professor is kind of wrapping up what he's doing, gathering his things, and not too long thereafter, he receives a call from a hospital in Chicago. And they say, Dr. So-and-so, I regret to inform you, your mother has passed away. He says, yeah, I know, she was hit by a bus while crossing the street in Chicago. He said, no, she was in an automobile accident. I have the official police report here. 2 automobiles collided, and she died on the scene. Well, which is it? His brother was an eyewitness. He was there. But the police report is official. Now, how do you harmonize these two accounts? This is where fact can be stranger than fiction. He gets to the hospital and he finds out the full story. There's no way to know this story at this point if this is all the information he has. He just has to conjecture or say there's contradictions, one's lying, one's correct. What really happened was his mother did get hit by a bus while crossing the street in Chicago, but she didn't die right away. They called an ambulance. She was transported to the hospital, and on the way to the hospital, the ambulance driver got into an automobile accident where she was killed instantly. Who would have believed it? If we were to come up with some kind of harmonization like that between these two events, it would sound outrageous. Are you kidding me? But that was the truth. That's the way it really happened. So again, I don't want us to just conjecture and come up with wild and crazy stories of how we might harmonize these things. I want us to look into Scripture and see what makes the best sense, what makes the best approach. Now remember, these are 4 independent writers. Supervision of the Holy Spirit over the whole process, sure, but these are 4 individual writers writing about the events as they seen them. Some details, some are going to write, some aren't. So how do we answer this question, what day and time of day did Jesus die? Dr. Ehrman says that John says he died before the Passover meal. But Mark says he died after the Passover meal. Now, would that be a contradiction if that were true? That would be a contradiction. You can't both die before a meal and after a meal. It just can't happen, right? Would be a true contradiction. So let's look at John first. John 19:42, then Matthew 27:62, then Luke 23:54, and then lastly we'll look at Mark 14:1 and 2. So we begin with John 19:42, since that's where Dr. Ehrman began. What does John say about when Jesus died? What day and time of day?
Therefore, on account of the Jewish day of preparation, because the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there.
What day? He describes the day of preparation. We need to know our Old Testament history here, don't we? What was the day of preparation, and what was its relation to the Passover meal? Does anybody know off the top of their head? The day of preparation is not the same day as the day of Passover. It is the day before. You don't have to take my word for it. Go back and do the research. Or actually, it's spelled out in the Gospels as we go along. We'll see that. But so John says Jesus died before the Passover meal. Now, we may want to take into account here this Jewish system of keeping time. How did they keep time? Was it morning till evening? I think Marty said this last week. It was 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. That was their day. So you could have a day that went from 6 p.m. to part of the next day, right? To 6 p.m. So in our mind, it's 2 days, but in their mind, it was 1 day. But the day of preparation was the day before the Passover. The Passover started at 6 p.m. one day. We must be before that, right? Sometime before 6 p.m. the day of the Passover would qualify as the day of preparation. Even in our mind, if it was the same day, does that make sense? Morning was still part of the day before in the Jewish calendar. Evening started the next day. So evening was the Passover meal. That's when they had the Passover supper. But the day of preparation was just that. It was the day you prepared. That's the day you did the work. That's the day you prepared the food, because when the Passover came, you weren't to take time to do all that. This was a quick thing, right? You ate standing up until that tradition was changed, and it was a very fast thing. So John specifically says it was a day of preparation, which is the day before the Passover. What does Matthew say?
On the next day, which followed the day of preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees gathered together to Pilate.
Okay, I didn't give you all the verses there, but if you read before and after there, Jesus died on this day, which is the day of preparation, which is the day before the Passover. What does Luke have to say?
I'll back up to verse 52 where it gets to context.
Yes, thank you.
It says, "This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And he took it down and wrapped it in linen cloth and laid it in a tomb cut into the rock where no one had ever lain. It was the preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin."
Okay, what day was it? It's preparation day. Was it before the Passover? It was before the Passover. So far, we're not really finding any conflict. They're all in agreement. But what about Mark? Actually, I gave you the wrong verses. I apologize. Okay. I've got extra notes here in case I'm challenged. We don't need to go back that far. Mark 14, verse 12 and verse 16, if you would, please.
And on the day of the unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, the disciples said unto him, "Where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover?" And he sent two of his disciples and said unto him, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you." How much money?
16. Or you can just read verse 16.
And wherever he enters, say to the master of the house, "The teacher says, where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?"
So, was this the day of Passover? Matthew, Luke, and John said Jesus died on the day of preparation, the day before the Passover. Mark seems to indicate that Jesus had the Passover meal. the day of the Passover. This would be a contradiction, would it not? Jesus is supposed to already be dead and in the tomb this day. How do we reconcile this?
He died after 6 o'clock in the evening.
He died after 6 on, meaning the day of the Passover? That might conflict with what we read in the other Gospels, right? Where he was laid. Okay, I like the ideas. Keep them coming. This is how we do this, right? We see something that looks like it's not right. Dr. Ehrman specifically called this out. We need to have an explanation for it. It seems that there's a contradiction, but we know that Jesus wasn't still on the cross when 6 p.m. happened. Why did they want his legs broken to take him off the cross?
So they can hurry up and finish it before the day was over.
There wasn't going to be any work done. You know, they're not going to embalm the body and put spices on it and take it to the tomb during Passover. There's other clues in here, but I want us to think who's doing the talking here. Who initially said this was Passover? It wasn't Jesus. Could it be, I'm just throwing this out there, that Jesus kept the Passover meal the day before, the day of preparation, because he knew he was about to die? The disciples said, where do we need to go to prepare? It doesn't say that they hung around until the day of Passover. That would be in conflict with the other scriptures. There's other clues here. Let's look at Mark chapter 15 and verse 42. So Mark just told us that they ate the Passover meal, which indicates this was Passover. He should have already been dead in the tomb. A few verses later, what does he say in verse 42, chapter 15?
And when the evening had already come, because it was the preparation day, this is the day before the Sabbath. 15:42.
What day was it? It's preparation day. What did the disciples mean? Where do we go make arrangements to eat the Passover meal? Did they know Jesus was about to die, even though he told them on more than one occasion? They didn't really know. They were anticipating that they were going to celebrate this feast with the Master on the day of Passover. Could Jesus have celebrated it a day early? In fact, Jesus' words were, keep the Passover. He was keeping the Passover. This wasn't the day of the feast. He was keeping the Passover with his disciples. Because clearly, later on in Mark, this was still the day of preparation. This was the day before the Passover. So when Dr. Ehrman says Mark specifically says Jesus died after, he's assuming we're talking about the actual day of Passover that Jesus had this meal, which is incorrect. It can't be true. In fact, during the meal, in Mark, Judas gets up to leave. What are the other disciples assuming? Oh, he's going to buy additional provisions for what? For the Passover. They hadn't completed the preparation for the Passover meal, yet they were eating this meal with Jesus. This wasn't the Passover meal. The fact that they thought they were leaving to go buy the rest of the provisions shows that this wasn't the Passover meal. Marty?
Now that two of our children have married, we've got other families involved with the holidays, so sometimes, I'll say it this way, and nobody will think anything strange about it. We have our Thanksgiving on a different day than Thanksgiving. Or we might have our Christmas on a different day, so the families can be together at the in-laws and the outlaws and everybody. And it might be, I've heard people say, oh, it's Christmas. Well, we had our Christmas last week. Or we had our Thanksgiving. Or we're going to have it next week because so-and-so can't be here until next week. But it's that same kind of an idea here.
I think so. I don't think there's a contradiction. And for the listeners on the tape, Marty said it's not a strange idea for someone to have Thanksgiving a week before if they have multiple family events, or Christmas a couple of days before, or even a week before, or I've even heard it done a month before. With Mazzalongos, is any of them in here? They've had Christmas well in advance of Christmas, right? Is that okay? Sure, it's okay. I think Jesus kept the Passover meal with his disciples before, because clearly he died the day of preparation, which is the day before the Passover. Now, I'm not all that smart, and I could see this, and I could find this. Why can't someone like Dr. Ehrman reason this out? And I think it goes back to the comment I made the first class we had is we have two types of readers when it comes to Scripture. We have sympathetic readers, those who are seeking truth, they're reading, they're trying to understand, sincerely, earnest. And then there are those who just read the words. You come across a contradiction, oh, well, these contradicts themselves, must not be true, and they do no further research, or they, from that point, mount arsenals to try to defend their position. But a sympathetic reader would read all this context and figure out, well, this wasn't really the day of Passover. They all harmonized. Jesus died on the day of preparation, according to all the Gospels. Now, did we skip an author? I think we read everything we wanted to read, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John on this? Okay. Luke 23:54.
My comment was on what you said about him going to give the vision.
Yes.
Back to the context.
Right.
Read the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, don't just come across this one verse that says, oh, they're celebrating the Passover meal and call it good. Well, you never do that with Scripture, right? You're going to find yourself in trouble. What about the time of day? Dr. Ehrman says that John says Jesus died at noon. Mark says he died at 9 a.m. And this is from the audio that we played, well, which is true. So let's look at Matthew 27, 45 and 46 and verse 50. It's 45, 46 and verse 50. Mark 15:34. Mark 15:34. Luke 23, 44 through 46. And John 19:14. Starting with Matthew, what does he say? Looking for the time. What time of day did Jesus die? And I may not have included enough context here, we'll see. But
Now from the 6th hour until the 9th hour, there was darkness over all the land. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? In verse 50, and Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit.
what hour according to Matthew?
The 9th hour.
9th hour. Mark 15:34. What does Mark say?
My God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders heard said, behold, it is light.
Yeah, that's the verse. Unfortunately, when I wrote these down, I was pinpointing the verse where he died, but the context there, if we back up, is going to be the 9th hour in Mark as well.
Oh, yeah. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour.
It's 9th hour in Mark. What about Luke?
In the 9th hour, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, around.
Well, it depends on whose time you're using, Roman time or Jewish time.
Jewish time.
Yeah, Jewish time, 9th hour would be about 3 p.m., if I'm not mistaken. What did Luke say, Marty?
Luke chapter 23, verse 44. It was now about the 6th hour, and darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour, because the sun was obscured, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. And Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Having said this, he breathed his last.
What hour? 9th hour. What does John say?
John 19:14 says, and it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It is about the 6th hour. Pilate said to the Jews, behold your king.
We don't have time to read all this chapter, but this is the only time you're going to get out of John. What time was it? It was the 6th hour. Was Jesus dead yet? Was he even crucified yet? According to this context. There was a lot of events that happened. There was this 3-hour period of darkness, right? For one, I don't know how Dr. Ehrman says that Jesus, or that John claims Jesus died at noon. I don't see that here. The only time we get from John is this one here at the 6th hour. Now, there were events that followed. Could it be possible that these events that followed took 3 hours and he died at the 9th hour exactly like the other accounts say? John doesn't give us the time of death. He's just not in here. We can't say the 6th hour is when he died because the context doesn't support it. So you see what we're doing here. We're doing exactly what Dr. Ehrman says we need to do. Read the Gospels horizontally. We've taken this one event. We're looking for the time of death. We're reading it across all the Gospels to see if they match. And what we find is they match, and John doesn't give a time of day. Is that a discrepancy? Is that a contradiction because John doesn't list the time of death? No. That's a detail that's in the other Gospels that wasn't important enough for John to write down. I shouldn't say important enough. It's just something he didn't do. By the way, did these guys have computers with unlimited memory and just type as many details as they want? Was it a little harder for them to record history than it is for us today? I think they would have done much more planning before they got that parchment out and they started writing things down, because that was expensive resources, very time consuming. You had to know what you're going to write in advance. You just can't hit the backspace and redo a whole paragraph. I think they would have been much more careful in their planning of writing, and anything left out, I think, would have been to make room for something else, for example. Mike?
I think one thing that is important is to first examine the fact that God gave us 4 Gospels. In other words, He wanted us to have 4 Gospels, which meant that He wanted 4 different points of view of all the events, or I say all of them. Not all the events are in the 4 different Gospels. In fact, we know they're not, because the Word is not in all 4 of them. But there's a reason why God wanted us to have 4 different points of view on these events. He didn't put them there to make people like your professor happy. You know?
Yeah. Well, let's go back to my example of the 4 writers in this congregation. And they're going to have different writing styles, write about different details, be much more explicit in some areas than others, each individually. How do we as readers get the full picture of the services, the activities, and the peoples of this congregation? How are we going to do that?
Comprehensive view of understanding of each person and what they wrote about this congregation. It's still the same information, whether Johnny said it or Dayton said it or somebody else said it. In context of what has happened here, which we can see and know, because we're part of, you can get a better understanding of it.
So what I think what you're saying is we shouldn't just read Johnny's account of the history of the congregation. We need to read all 4 to get the full picture. And aren't you glad we have 4? There are details in John that aren't in any of the other Gospels. There are details in Luke. For example, the very detailed accounts of the post-mortem appearances of the road to Emmaus, the disciples there. We don't have those in some of the other Gospels, and I'm glad that it's that way, because when we read all of them, we get the big picture. Now, at the end, we're not going to get there today, but going back to this idea about how many angels at the tomb, were they standing, were they sitting, this possible idea of multiple tomb appearances, we're going to put all this together at the end, and I will read to you a chronological order of events that I have put together, being just a layperson, silly, uneducated. If I can figure this out, surely anybody can. Marty?
You may have mentioned it while I had my head down trying to find my text, but the Jews and the Romans and the Greeks didn't keep time the same way.
Right.
We talked about the Jews starting their day at 6 in the evening and going to 6 the next evening, which is weird. Why would anybody do that? That's just strange. Well, why is that strange to me? Because I was born into a culture that started the day at midnight, and you go from midnight to midnight. I think John is writing from the perspective of either the Romans or the Greeks, who kept the day from midnight to midnight. So when he says the 6th hour, it's 6 in the morning. Another thing is, how many people in here would know what time it is if I said be back tonight at 1800 hours? 1800 hours is when?
6 o'clock.
That's 6 o'clock.
6 p.m.
Okay, and if you buy an electronic watch or a clock, it's probably going to give you the option to use 24-hour time. It's the same time.
Right.
It just said 2 different ways. And it used to throw me off until I learned it. Now that's the way I love to do it, because I know if somebody's saying AM or PM, I don't have to ask.
It's the same thing with if I say it's midnight. Well, what time zone are we talking about? Talking about Greenwich Mean Time? We talking about Pacific Time, Hawaii time? My favorite. I mean, what time are we talking about? But and to Marty's point, the important thing on the time is that all this had to be done by when? By Passover, right? According to Jewish calendar, 6 p.m. that evening. If you go by the Roman time, 6 a.m., you still had plenty of time to get all this done before the Jews were to celebrate their Passover, regardless of whose time that you want to use here. But I agree with Marty. I think John was using Roman time when he wrote. Now, was that one or two bells? Okay, so probably doesn't make sense to go into the next one, which is, did Jesus carry his cross all the way, or did Simon help? Some of these are going to be real easy. We're going to just knock through these next week. We're going to knock them out of the way. But again, since he took the time to list all these individually, we're addressing them. This is the basis of the lesson. Any other final comments or questions? You see what we're doing here, right? Scriptures are innocent until proven guilty. How do we harmonize?
Did not the Jewish day actually begin at sundown?
Yes. Which is odd to us, as Marty says. Maybe that's because in the Genesis account, God said there was evening and there was morning the first day. I mean, I don't know. I don't know for sure.
That's the real way to do it, because that's the way God did it in the beginning.
Yeah.
We're the weird ones, not the Jews.
Yes.
I would like to say that when claims like this are made for discrepancies, it can be intimidating until you start looking at them like we're doing now, and you find out, well, that's a foolish, baseless claim, but you wouldn't know that unless you knew the information that helped you understand that's a foolish and baseless claim. Just like, did Jesus carry his cross all the way? Well, everybody knows that Simon was compelled to carry the cross. What we don't know is, what a lot of people assume, and I'm jumping into next week a little bit. But
I don't want to forget by then, so it's good.
The text never says that Jesus fell. Now, he may have fallen or he maybe didn't fall, but for whatever reason, they compelled Simon to bear his cross.
But we sing about him falling. What are you talking about?
Right,
Of course
and we even have pictures of that. And there's even one of the seven points of the cross is where he fell, and yet that's not even in the text.
So, yeah, to Marty's first point, did Dr. Ehrman sound intimidating? He's a very educated man. I mean, I have a lot of respect for him. There's not all of his work is, majority of it's focused on contradictions and discrepancies, but he knows a lot about New Testament history. He really does. And when he's debating like this with whomever, things get heated and passionate, right? He sounded intimidating to me, that little audio clip. And I might be intimidated, like Marty said, if I hadn't taken the time to look at these myself. But
I know you didn't say this, but he appears to be disingenuous to me. See, now some of these points, I could see how you might have a question, but some of these, he knows the same things we know. And probably more things that we know.
And that's why I go back to, there may be a public reason for his abandoning the faith, there may be a private reason.
For example, I'm more than sure he is aware of the time thing.
On the Passover meal?
Cultures,
Yeah, that wasn't too hard to uncover.
But he's got to make his argument sound stronger.
Yeah.
So he's got to make the list bigger.
Now, I will tell you, this idea of the number of angels, their positions, was the tomb rolled away or not? Who went into the tomb? What did they see? Who was with Mary? That took me a little more digging. I spent all day on that one. And again, I'm not a New Testament scholar, but I was able to make these harmonize pretty easily.
In John 20, verse 1, it says, "Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came early to the tomb while it was still dark, and saw that the stone was rolled away, taken away from the center."
In what one?
John 20.
John says it was rolled away. Matthew specifically says an angel came down and rolled away, indicating it wasn't rolled away, and he sat upon it. There's a discrepancy there. We'll look into those. We'll look into the tomb, whether it was rolled away or not, next week. But that was the second bell. We won't keep any longer. Thank you for your attention. We'll see you next week.